Hi everyone, welcome back to another video in the Web Security Academy series. In today's video, we'll be covering lab number 9 in the cross-site scripting module titled Reflected XSS into a JavaScript string with angle brackets HTML encoded. If you do not have an account on the Web Security Academy, you can get one by visiting the URL portswigger.net/websecurity and clicking on the sign up button. I already have an account and I am logged in, so to access the exercise, I'm going to click on Academy. Select all labs, do a search on cross-site scripting labs, and then go to lab number 9 titled Reflected XSS into a JavaScript string with angle brackets HTML encoded. Alright, let's get started. This lab contains a reflected cross-site scripting vulnerability in the search query tracking functionality where angle brackets are encoded. The reflection occurs inside a JavaScript string. To solve this lab, perform a cross-site scripting attack that breaks out of the JavaScript string and calls the alert function. Alright, so the target goal over here is to exploit the reflected XSS vulnerability and call the alert function. Let's access the lab. Now notice over here, this is the built-in browser in Burp, and so all my requests are already being passed in my Burp proxy. As usual, when it comes to cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, what we're looking for is a parameter that takes in client-supplied input and then reflects it back in the response to the user without properly encoding the output. So over here, let's say test in the search functionality and click on search to see if the input is reflected back to us. And it is. So you could see over here, it's reflected in this heading over here. However, it might also be reflected in other parts of the code that are not directly visible to us in the browser. So if we go over here and search for the string test, you could see that there's two matches. The first one is the one that we do see in the browser. And then the second one is in a script tag. So it's in JavaScript. You could see the parameter is entered in a variable called search terms, and then search terms is being processed in this script right over here. All right, so there's two locations that could potentially be vulnerable for cross-site scripting attacks. The first thing I'm going to do is just see if the application encodes the less than sign or the angle bracket, because that's usually how I test for cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. So if we go back to the response and we look for search results, you could see over here it is encoded, which means that we can't use this in our XSS attack. And if we go to the second location where we saw the parameter being reflected, it's also encoded over here. Now, since this is in JavaScript and in a script tag, we might be able to break out of this string right over here much easier than the heading parameter without using angle brackets. So the way to do that is we're first going to copy this. And let's remove the spaces. And this is where our regular string would be. So the first thing we need to do is close off this single quote over here. So let's close it off with another single quote. And then what you could do is use the semicolon sign to say that's the end of the line or the end of this command right over here. And then add your alert command, add another semicolon. And then you need to close this string over here so that you don't end up with any syntax errors. And that's essentially it. So let's copy this. This would be your exploit right over here. Let's put it in here, click on search. And here we go. We get alerted with the string that we put in the alert function, which is just 01. Let's click OK, and we get the congratulations, you solved the lab message. So if we go back and look at how it was interpreted, let's remove this over here, go down to the script tag. You could see over here that it was interpreted as code, and therefore our cross-site scripting vulnerability was executed. And it's important over here to note that we closed off this string over here with another single quote and then a semicolon and then the alert function and then another single quote over here, just so that we don't run into any syntax errors that could potentially not allow our alert function to execute. Now, there is another way of doing this, and that would be by just using the dash or the hyphen or the minus sign. Essentially, what happens is it'll cast this to an integer, so it'll end up having the value NaN. Because it's not a valid integer, this also ends up having the value NaN. And then when it reaches this, so it's this minus this, but this is a function, so it will execute it. And then if you minus it over here, it'll also execute it. And then essentially, if you put an alert function just for search terms, you should end up with the value NaN, meaning that it wasn't really valid, but it does still execute our function. So let's copy this, put it in here. That's the second payload that you could use. Let's put it in here, hit search, and we should be presented with an alert function. And here we go. So we're presented with the window with the one string that we put in our alert function. Let's click OK. And that is it. So we successfully completed the exercise by exploiting the reflected XSS vulnerability. In the next lab, we'll look at another case of a cross-site scripting vulnerability.